Well, it's been a quiet week in Lake Wobegon, my hometown, up on the edge of the prairie. Here in the month of October, it's been chilly up there. It's been rather cold, and it was rather cold in the Lutheran church this last Sunday morning. The furnace gave out about 2 weeks ago, and they didn't call in a repairman because 4 men on the board were sure they knew how to fix it. But it turned out that they had only seen somebody else fix it, and there is a difference between being the passenger and being the person at the wheel. Passengers tend not to remember the route. It was chilly, and it was a reminder to Bud, the town maintenance man, to get out the blade and put it on the front of the truck and hook up the hydraulics so we have a snowplow when we need it, and to put on the storm windows on the town hall. And he went up to the cemetery, and he raked all the leaves, raked them into long windrows along the road, and he burned them up on the top of the hill. Clarence saw the smoke and drove up there, attracted to the fire. It was a beautiful fire. Billows of smoke and bright flames. They tended the fire for a while. And then Bud showed Clarence the 2 tombstones, the Rydells and the Soderlands, 2 tombstones not 50 feet apart, double stones. Mr. Rydell and Mr. Soderland had died years ago and left room for their wives to lie beside them. And they had written in their wives' names and their wives' birth years, and it just remained the blank to fill in the year of death. And on both tombstones, it said 19, and then there was a blank. Those men had died some time ago, and the ladies were old, and so the 21st century seemed like a long way away, I guess. But now our cemetery is not Y2K compliant. And Bud said, you know, those ladies got 2 months to go. Otherwise, they face additional charges. Filling in that 19, making it 20, that's not going to be cheap. Clarence said, how are those ladies doing? Well, Bud said, I don't know about Mrs. Rydell. She moved to Arizona, but Mrs. Soderland, Maisie Soderland, she's 93 years old, and she still drives a car. She goes to visit old people in nursing homes. It's been chilly up there, and the landscape has become more and more somber. The stubble in the fields against the brown of the tree line, and you drive those back roads and you see that dirt road that goes back to the old farm place that's been abandoned for 50, 60 years, been standing there. And now that little white frame house all fallen into the cellar, and the barn still standing, but the roof has fallen, and the haymow has fallen, and the floor, and down below where the cows used to stand, trees are growing out of the cracked concrete. It stood there all these years as a reminder to us, and now what it was meant to remind us of is happening all over again as farms fail all across Minnesota and farmers are cast adrift because corporations can afford to produce things at less than cost over a period of time, but human beings cannot produce corn and pigs and cattle at less than the cost of production. And so people who never thought this would happen to them have been forced to sell out and move off the land. And now in the vestibule of the Chatterbox Cafe, you see notices that you never saw there before. Alongside auction notices, you see notices, chronic depression that doesn't go away, anger you're unable to handle. If you need help, call this number. And posters that mention things that we don't talk about in ordinary conversation: alcoholism and domestic abuse and suicide. And in the sidetrack tap, business is booming now that the days are shorter and so many people are facing hard times. It's full of men every night. Men who at this time of year feel this nostalgia and remorse and grief. Old tragedies you thought you had forgotten come back as if they had happened yesterday. Lost friends and lost children and missed trains and ships that left without you. Your ship, you were waiting for it for years to come in, and then it came in, and you were busy with something else, and you thought, I'll catch the next one, and it left without you. And the sound of that whistle tells you there will be no more ships for you. Your ship left. Way back in the early 50s when Herbert came up to you and he said, let's go out to California. I hear there are good jobs out there. We can stay with my aunt in Pasadena. And you said, no, I promised my dad I'd help get the corn in. And Herbert left. And now he is doing so well out there that when he comes back, he has to be careful not to brag in front of you. And you're 55 years old. You're on the skids. What's going to happen to you? Men are so brittle. Men are on the edge of panic more than you'd ever guess. It's the women who are resilient and who hold things together. They sell off the farm. They sell off the farm, and to the woman it comes as a relief because this day of reckoning has been looming for years, and it's finally a relief when it's here and it's done. But the man can't forget. They sell off the farm, and they sit and they cry for 3 days, and then they move to the little bungalow in town. And she gets her hair cut, and she enrolls in the computer training course, and she sets her face toward the future. This is our new life, and we'll make it as good as we can and see how good we can make it. But he keeps looking back. And every day when she goes off to the computer course, he gets in his car and he drives back out that old road, and he parks there at the end of the cornfield, and he looks out across the field, and he thinks long, desperate thoughts. It's the women who march forward. It's Lot who looks back over his shoulder. It's Lot's wife who moves forward. These valiant farm women who've never had a makeover in their lives, women who don't read fashion magazines, because why do you want somebody to tell you that you're ugly and your sex isn't that good? Why? Women who don't go in for hair gels or sprays, and for whom the idea of pantsuits is somehow grotesque. Women who don't spray their hair, they just put on a cap or they put on a scarf. Women who don't care for liquor. To them, the taste of liquor is like antifreeze. Valiant women married to farmers. The most skilled profession there is in America that requires more courage and faith and sheer character than almost anything else, falling, failing, even as other people are earning 10 and 15 and 20% on their investments without ever getting out of their easy chairs. This is the scourge that surrounds Lake Wobegon. My Aunt Naomi and Uncle Nate had to leave the farm back in the 1920s. And they went through some hard times, though by the time I came along and was aware of things, they were settled in North Minneapolis, and she worked as a secretary at a lumber yard, and he worked as a mechanic. And every fall for a number of years, during the teacher convention holidays in October, I was put on the bus and sent down to visit them. My mother had 6 children, and Aunt Naomi had no children, so it was only fair to try and even things up a little bit. And my mother needed the older children to help, and the younger children were too young to go, so I was put on the bus. The middle child, at the age of 10, was put on the bus in a white shirt with wide lapels and a vest sweater I'd inherited from my cousin Bud, and dress pants and dress shoes and white socks, and my hair wetted and slicked down, carrying a cardboard suitcase. I was put on the bus with a note in my pocket that said, "To whom it may concern, this child is headed for 38th and DuPont Avenue North. Telephone number Aldrich 2408. And just in case, a $5 bill was put in my left shoe. I could feel it there. I rode in the seat immediately behind the driver, rode 2 hours in that bus down to Minneapolis, where Aunt Naomi and Uncle Nate met me at the platform. And she hugged me. And then she hugged me again for good measure. And then she wept over me. She was so happy to see me. I got into their Packard, and they drove me around downtown so I could look up at the Fauché Tower and I could see the Federal Reserve Building. And we always drove past Charlie's Café Exceptional so I could see the nude statue of the mermaid perched on the rock by the door. And we drove down Hennepin Avenue so I could see the neon signs, the neon sign of the line of women, their right legs moving up and down and up and down, and the bullseyes, neon bullseyes that got larger and then disappeared, and the neon champagne glass with the bubbles that rose in it. And then we went to their house, where they always gave me steak and potatoes and blueberry pie and ice cream, thinking that that was my favorite food, although I really preferred meatloaf. They had no children, so they were different from us, Naomi and Uncle Nate. They were large people. They were good eaters. They loved to eat. We had ice cream for breakfast, the only time in my life. My Aunt Naomi was almost perfectly round. She had a beautiful little round face and 3 lovely chins. She had plump legs, and she had little fat lines like a baby around her wrists and her ankles, and little plump feet. We sat on their living room couch, the 3 of us, and their 2 dogs, Wee Wee and Fifi, sat on their laps. I sat in between them, 2 large people, and watched a television show about a man who drove a bus for a living, whose friend worked in the sewers. And the fat man came home every night, and he was always excited about something, and he always jumped around. And he'd turn to his sweet little wife, and he'd say, "To the moon, Alice! To the moon!" Pow! Right in the kisser. We all laughed at this. We sat there, and we watched television. It was so exciting for a boy from a sanctified Brethren home. We had no television in our home. This was a home without children, and so my Aunt Naomi collected precious china figurines, so delicate, so fragile. She had them in glass cases that filled every wall of the dining room of their tiny house and 2 walls of the living room. Tiny china figurines of duchesses in ball gowns and princes and dogs and horses and couples doing the minuet. There were hundreds and hundreds of them, and salt shakers. She would bring me down her favorite figurines to show me. They had stacks of Life magazines, all the Life magazines you'd ever want to read in your life. And they had books. We didn't have books like this in our home. We had the Bible, and we had scripture commentary. They had novels in their house. They had beautiful novels. I would read them late at night. Books in which a heroine named Eugenia sat by the window at the plantation and waited for dear Randolph to come back from the war. But in the meantime, she met the despicable Wesley at a cotillion, and she fell in love with him. And when Randolph came home wounded, she had to tell him that she wasn't going to marry him anymore. And Randolph brooded over this. And then he came and he killed Wesley and killed himself. And then Eugenia sat at the window in black for the rest of her life as the drapes blew in past her. She looked out across the fields towards the tree line. I loved these stories. They were wonderful. They satisfied something in my soul. My aunt gave me the only sex education I ever got in my entire life. She told me once, she said, I don't know how much you know about this, but men are uniquely equipped, and so are women. Here's a book about it. I read the book, and it was my first encounter with words like vagina, and words like coitus and penis. These magical, forbidden words that I enjoyed saying over and over to myself. Secret, thrilling words. She was of my family, and yet they were not like us. Their home did not smell like our home. It had a musky, dark, exotic smell about it. And it took me a long time to realize that it was the smell of cigarette smoke and the smell of beer. She never smoked in front of me. When she needed to smoke, she went to the toilet and stayed in there for a while and came back out, and she smelled different. This was so exciting to me. The fact that adults were hiding something and that I knew what it was and they didn't know that I knew. And sometimes she and Uncle Nate would sit on the couch and watch television with me there, and they would drink something out of coffee cups that was not coffee. It was so interesting to see this. She was my relative, but she wasn't like us. I came from a family that never hugged. We were not huggers. Aunt Naomi was a major hugger. She hugged you to say hello. She hugged you to say goodbye. She hugged you about 15, 20 times in between. She adored me. She hugged me. She wept over me. It was my only experience in life as royalty was going to visit them. She would hug you, and to be hugged by a fat woman was a transcendent experience. It was like being a small moon that's taken into the gravitational field of a major planet. She put her great arms around me and pulled me in, and I felt her majestic breasts. I felt her fat arms holding me close, and her chins I could feel on the side of my head, and her cheek, and a fat tear rolling down her cheek. She never got over the wonder of having me around. This has never happened to me since. So I treasure it. I treasure it. She was the soul of kindness. And yet, being a sanctified brethren boy, I felt that I ought to tell my parents that they smoked and they drank and they had books that were about vaginas and about coitus. I felt that I should, because if you don't point out the sin, how is the sinner to reform? I almost did. A dozen times, I almost exposed them. They drove me home one year. They drove me home and they sat in our living room and talked. And then Aunt Naomi excused herself to go out to the outhouse. And she was gone for a while. I knew why. I was tempted to say something. But she was so kind. Growing up in the Sanctified Brethren, you always had the feeling that you were on parole. And that if you committed certain infractions, enough of them, you might be banished. But my Aunt Naomi, I knew, would never disown me, no matter what I might do. No sin was so horrendous that she would ever put me away. She was out in the outhouse. And I went into the kitchen and I looked out the back window just in time to see her jump out of the outhouse and pull up her skirt. And she was excited. She looked inside and then she looked towards the house. I ran out the door. She said, "Honey, the outhouse is on fire." I went inside, and there was smoke coming up from one of the two holes. And I put out the fire in the way that men are uniquely equipped to do. I came outside. "Oh, honey," she said. I was so scared. I said, "What happened?" It was the wrong thing to say. The pain in her expression, she was so embarrassed because she couldn't tell me the truth, and she couldn't lie and say, "I don't know," and she couldn't think of a story good enough. Finally, she just put her arms around me. That was how she resolved everything. Just threw her arms around me. And she pulled me close to her. And she kissed me a couple dozen times. And she cried. It was like I was no longer in my body. We were one body. One body. United. I'll never forget that feeling. She died years ago. And yet, whenever I think of her, I can bring her back. And she holds me tight again. I feel that, and I feel the gloom and the panic dissipate. Empires fall. Great schemes crash. Farms fail. Our lives are adrift. But kindness lasts forever. Kindness goes on forever. That's the news from Lake Wobegon, where all the women are strong, all the men are good looking, and all the children are above average.